those imports would actually lose out. So again, very classic kind of like textbook case of different impacts depending, at least on the short to medium term, depending on who you're actually looking at. The second part of the paper actually asked the question, given those different distributional impacts, does that actually influence the way RECs function in the ECOWAS and EAC? And the thing is yes, because the effects diverge between member states and within member states, sometimes member states feel the need to change the regional rate at a quite short notice, right? So the classic textbook example of this is a country that's had a bad harvest and is facing food supply shortages. In that case, that country might want to temporarily lower CET rates in order to import more and meet that supply gap. So that's why both in ECOWAS and the EAC, we found flexibilities that allow member states to temporarily diverge from CET rates. Flexibilities that are, in the long run, a bit counterproductive to the creation of a full-fledged customs union and a common market. Maybe I don't need to go too much in detail about how these instruments work. In ECOWAS, there's two instruments, the complementary measures of protection. One essentially allows ECOWAS member states to self-select tariff lines and then notify the ECOWAS Commission that they do not intend on applying the CET regs for a period of time. Quite simple. The other one is a more traditional safeguard measure, whereby if an ECOWAS member state actually sees a flood of imports into its market, it can respond by increasing tariffs in the short term to protect its domestic industries. There's an expectation that Nigeria, to come back to the first part of the paper about poverty impacts, there's an expectation, for example, that Nigeria will seek to apply these exemptions on the agricultural products that I mentioned that would actually lead to a negative impact on its agricultural producers, right? So Nigeria clearly opting for a policy of continued protection of its agricultural producers as opposed to lower consumer prices. In the EAC, again, I'm not an expert here, but you have the stay of application procedure, which I think functions by EAC member states going to the regional level once or twice a year, I think, to apply for an exemption, and they propose a new rate and they negotiate with their regional neighbors on whether that's warranted or not and under what conditions, etc. And you have the duty remission scheme, which is a bit more complicated, which basically allows firms to import inputs without paying the CET rates on the condition that they are then sold outside of the regional market so as not to engender unfair competition. And then again, I think we have a representative from Rwanda, so I hope I'm not saying anything wrong, but that Rwanda requested actually stay of application for products on the sensitive list that would have had a negative impact on its poor consumers. So again, Rwanda doing the exact opposite of Nigeria, choosing a different policy objective, which is the one of lowering consumer prices. The key thing to take away from the use of these tools for our paper is that they're useful. They allow member states to answer to short-term crises, such as domestic food shortages. Industries are complaining that the CET rates is too high for their inputs. But what they lead to is essentially a perforation in the regional CET, right? Both in ECOWAS and the EAC, as soon as you apply it, the CET is broken, and at least one member state. What that does, and I think the problem is more prevalent in ECOWAS than the EAC, but you encounter problems of transshipment. So if you remember, Nigeria heavily protectionist when it comes to agriculture. Its regional neighbor, Benin, which is a much smaller economy, does not have many productive capacity, has a big port, it's kind of like the import hub of the region, applies zero duties on the same products and their neighboring. What happens if you're a Nigerian importer is that actually you import through Benin and you smuggle it across the border because the price differentials in the two markets are so big. And there's no way that you can counter that. When you reach price differentials of 100, 200% in different markets, that creates opportunities for smuggling, for bribing of customs officials, etc. What that also leads to is mistrust at the borders, right? If you're a border agent, you might not really believe that invoice declaration that says that that product actually originates in your partner country because it could have been smuggled. So bottom line is that as you move forward, as you remove your internal barriers, eventually you have to solidify your common trade policy, and that calls for the removal or at least a modification of these instruments. How to move forward? The first lesson we have can seem a bit generic, but actually when we reviewed the legal instruments, the economic challenges between ECOWAS and EAC are essentially the same, right? The dynamics I just talked about on member states, perhaps not being able to agree on a common CET rates, or one member state in a regional grouping wanting to address its short-term national priorities and therefore requesting an exemptions. But there's striking differences in the way that RECs have answered these challenges, right? The role of the EAC Secretariat is not at all the same as the role of the ECOWAS Commission. The ECOWAS grouping, for example, has a cap on the number of exemptions that member states are allowed to seek per year, because it recognizes that if you use them too much, then you weaken the common external tariff too much. The procedures around, and in EIC, I think that member states have to negotiate between each other when requesting an exemption. Not the case in ECOWAS. In ECOWAS, member states just notify the Commission and don't talk to their regional neighbors. So it would be interesting, to see what works best, how these different tools are used in the most effective manner, etc. And I think it's kind of a, good place to point out that these two regs are, the EAC and ECOWAS, are at very different stages in their integration effort. The EAC has had a CET for a number of years now. It's been facing these issues. It's been, getting used to managing a common external tariff. ECOWAS will start in just about 2 months now. So I'm sure the ECOWAS Commission would actually very much like to know how the EAC deals with it. The second recommendation, which is closer, I guess, to the theme of the symposium, is that you have to recognize that any change in trade policy, as David said earlier, actually creates losers, right? And that's not something you can do much about. Even though in the long term it's worth it to do it, it pays off later, it increases competition on the regional market, etc. These adjustment costs do exist, and they mobilize, right? The people that lose out, they mobilize, they go to their national government to ask for exemptions, etc. Some countries and regional groupings have dealt with this problem in a very smart manner. They've created adjustment funds, right? So in the EU, we have one big regional fund that comes to the help of regions that are losing out from the integration process. The EU basically says, we know that the market conditions are going to change because we're integrating, and we're going to help industries or workers to reconvert somewhere else. Now that does two things, basically. It allows you to minimize the adjustment costs, but it also lessens political opposition to the integration project. It lessens the incentives that business have, or that governments have sometimes, to request exemptions, right? And the third policy recommendation we'd have, or more avenue for reflection if you want, is actually to work on the procedures at the national level that lead to the submissions of these requests. Sometimes, I'm not sure about the situation of the EAC, but in ECOWAS, in some countries, the losers from regional reform have a disproportionate access to national trade policy making processes, and that incentivizes countries to ask for more and more exemptions. Whereas, if you had a process, a set of regional guidelines that made sure that everyone around the tables were listened to, and that the national position would be reflecting of all these different interests in the country, then you might come, it might be easier to find arrangements later on at the regional level.
I found this paper, the paper I read, and I think it wasn't totally different, very interesting and informative in the context of why these provisions exist across the countries, and how they impact the outcomes, and especially the mechanism that he well described in terms of impacting on poverty through price changes, wages, profits improvement, and revenue. I also found it interesting, and especially during the presentation, the specific examples which you have seen of Rwanda and Nigeria. You could possibly also talk about other examples and other commodities. And one of the things that you find, especially in the Uganda context, areas around rice, of course, around the steel sectors, and the like. What also becomes important and is covered, but for emphasis, is the time dimension around these processes, and then what do you do and how do you manage these processes. And to me, maybe the message I really have is about Trademark East Africa supporting more of this analysis around these different sectors and country impacts. Because you will appreciate that when all this took place 2005, I'm sure many people knew little of what was going on and what impacts they meant. A few of the business people involved had their own self-interest. They were direct, they were immediate, and they were able to lobby. And some of these people could reach the highest offices. So now, as time moves on, infrastructure improves, which again is what Trademark East Africa is all about, and all these good things we have talked about, the other transmission mechanisms or changes that are taking place with implications over time. And therefore, those who still know analysis around the time and the effects and the changes, I think there is a lot of research work that could be done. The other point that is interesting for emphasis is the impact on the different categories of people. I think the aspects, and in the paper I read, they are well put, but I think this is a question of emphasis, and again, an area of research. It's easy to talk about the rich and the poor, and in each of these contexts, you can put it in two contexts and deal with specific commodities and regions. If you are in Liberia, where I have ever been, and you deal with these things with their imports levels of rice in that area, different dynamics. From if you are in Uganda and you are talking about rice, important, yes, and consumption habits are changing, yes, but we have another set of staples that we mix into this rice, and that has different dimensions, creating room for studying different impacts. Urban and rural, and as I've said already, really is the different value chains impacts in this. So in this, I personally see scope for research to inform policy, especially, but also to impact on mindset change on these impacts, because some of these debates tend to be more not necessarily fact-based, but more of emotions and passion. And at times when you have numbers there, and you combine them with the time dimensions of this, and then you provide what it is in terms of programs or safety nets that need to be done, and with the experiences, as I have said, of lessons learned in these areas, then you have good room for informing policy, for informing program implementers like Trademark East Africa, and also the various stakeholders, civil society and the like, that need this type of information. In this regard, I remember many years ago when I was more active in these kinds of work, I used to have challenges with Siatini when we were trying to modernize agriculture in the country to make it what we thought would be more competitive, but then here and there would crop up, but this will cause a problem and this, and you think it is a small thing, but you know, it depends on the voice, you know, of those who are talking, you know, rather than at times when you don't have the quantification of these numbers. So really my contribution within the context of what has been done and within the context of the paper that I've done is basically an advocacy one, which is very well put in the paper, of the scope for more in-depth analysis, you know, across the regions and sharing information. And incidentally, one of the challenges is this, the communication challenge. So each country here, when they were presenting, you know, there are country groups that are engaged, and the chairperson talked about quarterly meetings. But then at the end of the day, when policies are being made and the debates are rising, you realize that there is another big cross-section of people which don't know actually what was happening, and they are raising issues which could have been long resolved. So the analysis, very important. Now, communication around these engagements and the results, I think equally very important, especially when you are cross policy, and especially when we have our leaders now meeting quite regularly and engaging in all kinds of issues and debates, and put the potential for, if there isn't enough information or enough discussion about the issue, of getting a response and that carrying the day. By the time we are going to correct it, it takes, you know, quite of time. So the analysis, the sharing of this information, and then the informing the trademark type of people, but also in the government and all that, of these programs that can either create the safety nets or mitigate, if any, these impacts, so that then you can possibly quickly be able to move away from these mechanisms that allow flexibility in implementation of the sets.
Before we had the common external tariff, every country had a similar process, but being done at national level. If you may recall, around that time, the budgets used to be read and all measures would come into effect at midnight tonight. I don't know whether you remember that. Today, you have time, the budget is read, the measures are discussed, they're in the open. Even before the budget is read, the measures are published in the papers. This is what is likely to happen. So, for me, and many of you who saw that one happening and are seeing this happening today, my conclusion can only be that it can only get better. We are definitely better than we were yesterday, and it can only get better. We have another discussion on the common external tariff again. I would like to seek your indulgence because at 5:05, session B will come back here. And if we've not yet finished, I'm not sure whom we shall deploy to lock them outside. I wanted to propose that we receive the second presentation. This is on the impact of the common external tariff on government revenues and the population, so that this ties well into the first one, which was the common external tariff and poverty reduction, so that then we can discuss both of them, because I believe some arguments are likely to move from poverty reduction to government revenue. If you do not have strong reservations about this, I would like to invite Mr. George Madoda to come and present to us the second one, which is the impact of the common external tariff on government revenues. We discuss it, then we can discuss both. Maybe we'll have a few more minutes to discuss both of them.
I'll tend to look at the rate that was assigned on product and the revenue that may support competitiveness, and that may support the poverty alleviation process. I don't go beyond that. We'll stick there and see how the tariff rate, the income, can support the revenue, can increase revenue, can improve revenue, and see how the rate can support the improvement of country's competitiveness in two areas. One, the country itself to be competitive. Two, competitiveness of manufacturers or local producers in the country. We'll go through the study objectives, methodology, and overview, and whatever fit up to the recommendation. But you may tend to skip some area where you can speak briefly and see how we can come up with the conclusions. I do believe every single country, when you want to be engaged in a certain policy, you want to introduce a policy, I believe you are prepared. And do you know what a policy is? In this context, I'm not going to define a trade policy in a different way, but as an instrument and objective. If you can go with that one, then we'll get the result of what we tend to see. With this study, we'll need to analyze the impact of set implementation on improved government revenue. Secondly, analyze the set implementation on improved country's competitiveness and the implementation on poverty alleviation process. We'll need to look at and review the tax collection and its rate, which is expected to improve revenue. You know, when countries decided to have the common external tariff, they had to decide on which product and on what to assign the rate. For instance, they have what they call sensitive product, and they have what they call non-sensitive products. A 0% was given to agricultural input or raw materials for every import of agricultural product. 10% was assigned for intermediate product and other essential industrial input. 25 for finished product, and 25 and above for higher sensitive product. Now, if you decide to have a policy on this product that will set this is the rate, I assume that you had an intention of reaching a certain goal. Not only government revenue, but other areas, such as to see how the rate will improve competitiveness. If products are imported from, for instance, from France, I believe that the rate that you assigned on the finished product will come in, and the rate will support the local manufacturers of the same product so that they may compete with the same product exported in the country. I do believe the product that are exported outside the EAC countries were given special rate, which will support the poverty alleviation process. One, in terms of the rate. Two, in terms of the revenue. Let me explain this. If I talk about the rate, I'm talking about how poor population can also afford to get same product or consume it. If I'm talking about the income, the revenue that countries collected from that particular product that was exported in this country, I believe the certain amount of money on that revenue will be allocated to support poverty alleviation initiative. Only a few countries have done that. And that's why we need to see the impact of the common external tariff. How does it work? Today, if you move in a village, and you tell the population that we implemented the common external tariff, we collected this much, and 2% of the common external tariff revenue is what we are coming to implement initiative for poverty alleviation based on the integration. Don't you think that the population will be happy to understand that the integration that they are in is much more of help because they are getting something which is coming from the policy they have implemented? Let's move a bit fast. To realize all this, how much is contributing, we had to go and look at, we used the growth rate of exporters from outside, exporters in EAC partner states, how much they're penetrating the market, how much they're competing in the market, and how much the same revenue is contributing to the poverty alleviation. There are countries in Africa that they are accepted to implement the policy, and this worked because they had a purpose. They decided to have initiatives and funded the initiatives and supported competitiveness of local producers and supported government spending. Industries produce in EAC markets in each particular countries, but we still have a challenge of implementing the industrial policy, which can support the industrial sector to be more competitive. You may find that a Matchbox is imported from the rest of the world and being used, let's say, in Tanzania or Burundi. You wonder how comes that there are no industries that can produce the same Matchbox. Those are some of the questions we need to ask ourselves. Which means the Matchbox is competing in the market, and yet we look at it and we don't want to compete on that Matchbox as a product itself. The growth of industries are going down because of issues, political problems, war, and whatever. Some are afraid of their securities. Now you find that others take advantage to import into a market. The trade performance. of ESC countries. Before they set implementation, people are using MFN, people are using different tariffs. So those countries were having their own tariffs to try to protect their market and increase their government revenue. But did that help? And later, when they joined together in an integration, they decided to have a customs union and come up with a common external tariff. I do believe the common external tariff that they decided to have, they first simulated and looked at the impact of it on these three areas: on the population, on government revenue, and competitiveness of their local industries. In this chart, we can see that the introduction of common external tariff and the implementation did not have a negative impact. It's because some of exporters into ESC market were using higher tariff. And when the tariff on common external tariff was introduced, then it seemed they were favored. The rate went down, and it was much more easier for them to access the market. Let's see Rwanda market. The trade structure of how much the exporters are accessing our market. At what percent? You see China at 13%.